Okay, let's get started. A few people might be filtering in still, but we'll get things underway. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back, those of you who were at the last session, and welcome to anyone who's just joining us this week. The series can be taken as a whole, or you can drop in and out on the topics as they are of interest and pertinence to you. So welcome, I'm Christine Valenza-Shin. I'm class of 84, and as the screen says, I'm Senior Associate Director of Advising and Programs at Beyond Barnard, which some of you may have known as Barnard Career Development or Barnard Career Services back in your day. So couple of housekeeping things up top. Just want to remind you that you don't have microphone or camera access during this particular session, so your voices, likenesses, or images aren't going to be captured by the college. However, if you choose to participate in writing, either through entering a question in the Q&A spot or in the chat section, we're going to do a couple of exercises where you might want to participate that way. That will be captured, not shared, but we try and record, try and take a look afterwards, make sure we didn't miss anything key. It is default, the Q&A and the chat are default set to everyone, but if you prefer to just ask a question directly to the Alumni Relations co-host or myself, you can change it to host or co-host. Great. I'm going to do all questions at the end, so feel free to enter them in the Q&A section as they occur to you, and then we'll get to as many as we can. And I think that's enough to get us going. So we're looking today at resumes. We're getting into specific details and some specific strategies. Okay, great. Let me see if I can get this to stop on the right side. Just a reminder that this series is part of our Beyond Barnard Summer Colloquium, a new set of programming for us, trying to help fill the need that many people are facing, students, recent graduates, and all alumni are facing in these unusual times. So check out other offerings. Of particular interest to some of you might be some of the joint offerings we're doing for students and alumni on graduate schools. We have a couple of series coming up focusing specifically on law school, business school, graduate school in the social sciences, graduate school in the arts and humanities, and we'll continue to develop programs about graduate school as we head into the fall as well. So today we're going to cover some resume basics. I'm going to assume as alumni that you have the basics down of, you have several versions at least of your resume. So we're not going to go through each section point by point, but some other basic things that might have changed since last time you put together a resume. And we're going to focus specifically on the idea of highlighting achievements. Then we're going to do a little bit of practice, do a couple of sample bullets, and then a collection of do's and don'ts and FAQs I've gathered over the years of working with students and alumni on their resumes. So just wanted to note that today, while we are focusing on resumes, the next two sessions are also relevant to some of these same topics and issues we're going to talk about today. So specifically next week, we'll look at cover letters, and the following week at LinkedIn profiles. And the thinking about the three together can be helpful. We sometimes call them job documents, but they're the tools that you're going to work together with to present yourself throughout your job search process. So we're going to take a quiz. Barnard women love quizzes, I'm sure. So Lacey is launching that now. Let's take a second to answer these two simple questions to get us started. Give you a little bit more time to make up your mind. Okay, so for our purposes today, we could certainly debate each of these options, but for our purposes today, we're going to look at the resume primarily in terms of getting an interview. One of the things I found over the years in my role as an advisor is that it's easier to think and more strategic to think about the resume in terms of getting to the next step. And so when you apply to something directly, your goal is getting to the next step, whether that's a closer read of your resume, and then the following step would be the first round of interviews. So definitely, the majority of you, 52%, picked a record as of your work experience, and there's an element of that, but we are actually going to try and shift your focus a little to a curated record of your work experience, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. You have a lot of control over what you choose to put in any specific version of your resume, and you do want to pick and choose and curate, and not be looking to have a complete record. And yes, of course, ultimately a resume is to get you a job, but we again encourage you to think of it one step at a time in terms of your overall strategy. And resumes do tend to stress you out, but it's not their main purpose. Then we get to the second question, which is an interesting one, which is how long does a prospective employer initially spend reading your resume? And sadly, you all are correct. 52% of you chose 30 seconds or less, and 43% 20 to 60 seconds. And the dreamers in the group, the optimists in the group, picked 2 minutes. And nobody picked 5 minutes. So it's interesting there. There's a lot of career advice online tends to follow. There's a lot of quoting of studies without citing the study. So it was interesting. I went down a couple rabbit holes this week trying to find the original sources for some of these legendary things. So the one that I came up with, there was an interesting study done a few years back at The Ladder, which is a career advice website, and they found specifically that recruiters, so people who are wading through lots and lots of resumes, spend 6 seconds on average taking a look. So that's why I went with the 30 seconds or less. It's hard to measure this. Different people do different things. I think recruiters are different potentially from HR people, who might be different from the actual hiring manager. It depends on who's sifting through them and their particular approach. But I think the key takeaway here is that there's 2 readings to a resume, and we want to address how to hold up to both readings. That quick initial screening as they're scrolling down a group of resumes and trying to quickly glean information, that your resume needs to hold up to that. And then should you make it into the second pile, the closer look pile, and we're going to talk about how to do that, then your resume needs to hold up to that closer look, where they do take longer to really look more specifically and dig into some of your bullets in particular. So great. So, and then I'm going to move that. So yeah, so just to recap, for our purposes, your main goal and our main strategic approach is how do you use the resume to get an interview, and then how long does it take? So, all right, so that closer look stage is important. I want to focus in, take a look at these bullets, but I want to focus in on a couple in particular. We talked last week about the open market and versus the hidden market, the public-facing job postings versus hidden, the networking part of it, and they do overlap. And so it's an important point that you'll hear a lot about the black hole and your resume just disappearing. I'm going to argue that that's not an effective way of thinking about things, and you need to follow best practices and do your best to navigate the digital landscape that we're all living in. But the networking can be very key. Because you're applying in a timely way, you do almost always, whether you are able to use a contact to get a particular viewing or not, you still have to follow the formal process. So that's why the advice is to submit. And ideally, you would already have a contact or have already talked to a place that you're applying to. But in reality, you may be applying to some place that you hadn't heard of before and haven't had a chance to look. So, you know, if you think you have a good chance of getting a quick response, you could reach out before you submit. But generally, the advice is to get it submitted and then take a look, see if there's someone in your network, someone who knows somebody that you could then approach about getting, you know, having a conversation about their experience working there, and then some specific advice and possibly the offer to refer you to whoever's doing the hiring. And then I wanted to just talk a little, because it goes into the next slide, about reconciling the first point to customize your resume to the job description and the fourth point to apply within 24 to 48 hours of the job being posted if possible. They are both best practices, but they can feel a little contradictory. And if you have to choose one over the other, then you choose customizing your resume. You choose taking that a little bit of extra time to tweak and really give thought to how you can target your resume at the job description. Not everybody does that. A lot of people don't do that. So this is one of the key ways of standing out and really improving your chance of getting into that second pile, that second stage where someone's going to take a closer look at your fit. In a recession, in a competitive job market, it is important to be timely. Doesn't mean you can't apply to something that you didn't see until it's been up for a few days or a week or even a month. You absolutely can. But when there's lots of people applying to things on the open market, timely is good. But again, if you have to make a choice, if it means, you know, not getting it in for 3 or 4 days after the posting because you're not going to have time to customize it, definitely choose quality over speed. But let's look a little bit at how to do that. Okay, so how do we, sorry, I'm having a little trouble with an oversensitive mouse here. We did the quiz. Good. Okay, I want this. Come on. It does not want to talk. There we go. So one thing that can make this process easier, this process of customizing, is to use a master resume and application resumes system. It's something we've been teaching to our students and to our alumni over the last couple of years. The idea is you have a single document that lives on your computer for your eyes only, that's going to have everything in it, everything, including the kitchen sink. It could be 10 pages long, there could be 20 bullets, because no one's ever going to see it. And the idea is to have everything in one place as you, as to the extent that you can, and this is a living, working document. So what we're trying to prevent is if, for instance, there's something that's dropped off your main resume because it's old, but perhaps it's relevant to something that you are applying to in this customized resume you're preparing. So instead of having to hunt back through, you know, resumes from 2016 or 2010, or, you know, looking all over the place, the idea here is to gradually get all your old versions of your resumes, all your old bullets and various things into one place, so you can easily hunt through and cut and paste what you want when you're putting together a more specific resume. So application or networking resumes that's where you're going to polish and you're going to get it down to 1 or 2 pages, and that's the one you're going to customize. And a key point here, you're not starting from scratch each time. So one thing that tends to happen is, for instance, we talked last week about being flexible about the things you're applying to. So let's say you've decided to be flexible, go a little bit outside your usual field, or maybe you're going to think about looking at the nonprofit sector. If you've been in the private sector, what's going to end up happening is, as you apply to specific things, your resumes are going to kind of clump together. You know, so if you apply to nonprofit A next week, and then 2 weeks later see a posting for a similar nonprofit, you don't have to go back to the master resume and work from scratch. You would pull up the one that you just submitted 2 weeks ago to nonprofit A, and you would tweak it from there. So it does get easier. It can be a little bit hard the first couple of times, especially if you make some of the changes I'm going to recommend today, if they are in fact changes for most of you, but it should get smoother. And most people end up with sort of clumps of resumes. It's like, oh, here's my, here's my specific resume for writing jobs, and here's one that's more specific to teaching, etc. That second bullet under customizing keywords and short phrases, within reason, and make sure that it flows smoothly. You don't want to do it just for the sake of doing it. That's a piece of advice that emerged in the early digitalization ideas, that you should just use their words back at them. And, it's good advice, but temper it a little bit. And again, the whole idea here is you are curating this. As you're applying for a specific job, you're using that job description as a guide to what they're looking for. And then you are looking through your experiences, your skills, and choosing which ones to include and how to order them in order to make it really easy for them to see as they take that first quick glance that you're a good candidate. And just a couple of words about the specific heading. This is something that we've been working on with students and other and alumni over the last couple of years, is instead of having a single experience section or a experience section that's divided into paid work and volunteer work, our recommendation is to have, it could be one section or it could be two sections, but that main section that's going to be sort of the top half of your resume, and it's the jobs and experiences that you most want to call their attention to, that have the most relevance to what you're applying to. You want to group those together and then add a specific heading that does two things. The specific heading is going to both reflect what they're looking for and also is a good description of what you're including under it. So for instance, if you are applying to a job that heavily focused on writing and research experience, you could use that as the heading, writing and research experience, because that's what they're mainly looking for. And then you look at your, both your past jobs, past internships, past volunteer opportunities or projects that you worked on, and group together the ones that most closely focus on writing and research. And you still use reverse chronology within that section, but you're, again, curating the jobs, the things that you most want them to focus on, that most align with what they're looking for. Then you can use the second section. It could either be additional experience, it could be previous experience or earlier experience if it happens to work chronologically that way, or you may have a whole other set. I've definitely worked with alumni who've had, say, a teaching career and a research career, or law career and journalism, various combinations. And so sometimes it divides neatly into those two types of experiences. And if you are applying for law jobs, you would lead with your law section. And if you are applying to journalism or media jobs, you would lead with that. So that's a simple way. It's not simple because it takes a little bit of sort of nuance and finagling to make the choices, but in the finished product, it is one of the easiest ways when they're skimming to show them that you've got the experience and skills that they're looking for. Okay. Oops, okay. I seem to be having this issue. Okay, good. All right, and then one other basic thing I want to talk about, something that is not super new, but it's something that's emerged over maybe the last 10 to 15 years, is people who have, a decent amount of experience will sometimes lead with a profile or a summary of qualifications. Definitely optional, but it can be particularly helpful if you're making a shift or if your work history is particularly diverse and kind of, hits different sectors. So it's an opportunity. It's a little bit analogous. You'll look in a couple of weeks at the LinkedIn profile at the summary section there, or the about section there. And it's basically, the goal is to provide a framework for which you want the person who's reading it to see your resume. So you pull out and again, customize a couple of key points, key experiences, key skill sets. You can do a few sentences, you can do a few bullet points, you could combine sentences and both. And this would take the place of what some of you might have done back in the old days of the 80s and 90s of putting an objective. Objectives are obsolete, they're no longer used, and if you do want some sort of declaration at the top or sort of overall focus at the top, you would go with this, a profile or a summary of qualifications. And it's an interesting shift. It's a shift away from what you're looking to get out of the job, which is what the old objective was about, to a what are you going to bring to the employer? And that's sort of a shift that's taken place, and that's what you want to address with this. I'm just going to apologize for the last time because it's distracting. I seem to be having a problem with mouse and down arrows, but we will do what we can to. Okay, great. Okay, so now we're going to look a little bit at highlighting achievements. It was in the title of the session, and this is probably, again, another shift that's taken place, in how resumes work over the last 10 years or so, is to try and focus on highlighting achievements. And give you a second to read this and then say a few words about my favorite blog. So Allison Green writes a blog called Ask a Manager, and it's a workplace advice column. I find it educational, highly entertaining at times, and but she's very good on the job search stuff. And one of the things that she does a particularly good job, if you look in her archives, is about doing exactly what we're talking about today in the resume, is how do you make this more accomplishment focused? And again, it's all part of the standing out. Very few people do what she recommends, do what we recommend. And therefore, if you start to do what we recommend, if you haven't been doing it already, you should see an uptick in responses to your resume. It's not a guarantee, but that's the hope. So there's a couple different ways of approaching this. I want to give you a couple of specifics, to think about as you start thinking about how do you highlight your achievements, what kind of things do you want to focus on? And the master resume is actually a great place to practice this. One of the other ways I advise people to take advantage of the system is to write rough draft bullets, just in plain normal English. Write some additional bullets to what you've already got that try and capture some of these newer or more specific things that we're going to talk about over the next little segment here. So just thinking in broad terms, what is valued? And all right. Oh, you get a nice preview all the way to the end. Perfect. Okay. So they are these key things. So again, it's just helpful, and especially if you're shifting gears a little bit and changing, these can also be talked about in terms of transferable skills. So if you're venturing into something new, these key things, teaching or training you might have done, quantitative skills, data analysis, formal or informal leadership, any form of communication, and teamwork in general. These are all things that are valued, and you can think about your experiences in terms of that and how you want to highlight them. Bullets, as I said, are important when that second reading, when they're going to really dig in and look at the details of where you've been, what you've done. So this is a simple formula, and I probably should have said this earlier, but these are all suggestions. There's no one single way of doing this, but the goal here is to get you thinking in some new ways about how you can strengthen your resume and improve your chances of getting that interview. So you want to, almost always you're going to lead a bullet with an action and then quantify where you can, but we want you to think broadly about quantifying. It's the examples always seem to come from sales, or actually lately social media, increased click volume by X percentage. And, a lot of us don't do that kind of work or can't quantify it in that way, but there's lots of different ways to think about that, how frequent something is, how big the audience was, how, how many people you manage. There's different ways of doing that. And then if possible, and it's not always possible, think a little bit about if there was a specific outcome that, a specific purpose or outcome to this. It's a simple way of thinking about it, about structuring bullets. You guys are getting a nice preview of everything I'm planning. And the verb part of this, always helpful, again, to just, and we're going to do a couple practice bullets in a moment, and we're going to be keying off a different screen. So if you want to take a second to jot down a couple of verbs here that you particularly like, that you might not have used before, or that are particularly apt for the skills and experience you bring. So looking at, again, some of those broad categories of what's valued and what are some detailed specific language you can use. And then a little bit of look across industries, whether this is your current industry or something you're looking into. So again, if you want to jot down one or two of these that you might want to use in your sample bullet in just a moment. And then honing in a little bit on this specific idea of capturing achievements. I've compiled a couple of questions that I will often ask somebody when I'm working with on their resume, but you can ask yourself to try and tap into some of this. Like, it's more easily said than done. Describing, especially if that's the way you've usually done your resume, is easier, but really trying to capture some of these special, more specific things can be a little bit more challenging. So these are some questions to try and dig in a little to. I think the overall thing here is you're trying to get at what makes you good at what you do, what differentiates how you do a job from somebody else, or somebody who does sort of a more average, has a more average approach, but what makes you particularly good at some of the things you do, or all of the things you do. Okay. So be thinking about that. And then yeah, okay. Same problem. Great. And now we're going to do a little practice. Okay. So we've been talking about bullets. And so you could either take one of these scripts and fill in the blanks with your particular situation, or if none of these seem like a good fit, you could otherwise construct a bullet based on some of the earlier verbs you might have chosen. But take a second, and I'm going to give you about a minute to write a bullet. And then any of you who choose to share with the group, share a couple of samples. You can put it into the, not the Q&A segment, but the chat section. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so I can look at what you're sharing. Oh, wait, no, I'm going to keep sharing for a minute so you can pick one of them if you choose one of these. And then I'll stop sharing to look at what you've typed in. Okay, here's some good examples. Built reputation as a team player, designed and led. Built reputation for winning difficult cases. Sought out by colleagues to resolve conflict. built a content strategy practice. That I think could probably go a step further. I like that because it's specific, but then maybe, give a few more details, quantify it, maybe give some time scope. Awesome. And initiate a new system for tracking partner contact information and potential partners. Created a team board to engage youth in leaving. Nice. So you're giving the results or the purpose, negotiated programmatic agreement. Awesome. You guys are already good at this. And there's some good quantification, 500 plus. Great. So definitely, as you, if you follow the session by pulling out your resume, take a look at your bullets with this critical eye and use some of these, some of the verbs we talked about, some of these scripts, some of these ways to highlight achievements. And then if you are struggling with that, then that's definitely, you can follow up with an appointment to talk about your specific resume. So great. Okay, so that was just a little practice. I am going to head into, great, there's our fill in the blanks that we already saw. So I'm going to just end my part of the presentation with do's and don'ts and FAQs, and then turn it over to some of the questions I see are already coming in. So some of these repeat, some of these are repeating some of my key points, but take a look at some do's. And then let's take a look at some don'ts. Oh, sorry. How do I unpause my screen sharing? Huh. Oh, there we go. Green arrow. Should have been my first clue. Sorry. So. Okay. There we go. Do's and don'ts and FAQs. These were the do's. Let me give you a second to take a look at those. Again, some of these are a reiteration of some of my key points we've already looked at. And the don'ts. So as I said, objective is out. So any of you who either did that yourself or have parents telling you to do that, depending on your age. The other thing that's gone by the wayside from my early days in the 80s is references available upon request. You don't take up the space to say that on your resume. You can save that space for other things. We're on the lookout for subjective adjectives. That's where we want to be more specific and quantify. And you get a lot of questions about templates and graphic design. It's one of these things where if you see the exception there, if you are applying for something in a creative field or specifically graphic design or something like that, then yeah, you would want to more either have somebody else design your resume for you or do it yourself. And also, if you can tell from either the company description or even the way they've written their job description that they appreciate outside the box creative thinking, that would be another opportunity. I've certainly also seen plenty of people who have just added some simple graphics and design elements without a lot of flashy color and symbols and things that are within the norm of sort of basic black and white on white paper resumes. That's fine. I think the key message is plain is fine, plain and clear is appreciated. And if you want to add a few design elements that, look good to you, but don't go overboard unless you're one of those exceptions there. Right? Okay, some FAQs. I get some pushback on this first one where, generally speaking, you lead with your education if you've just graduated from Barnard or if you're 1 or 2 years out and it's still kind of the most relevant or most impressive thing about you. But generally speaking, once you're out of that first job and into your second job, you are going to flip that. You're going to lead with your experience because it's more relevant to what you're applying to, and you're going to drop education down to near the bottom. The key thing I always tell people is they're always going to look at where you went to school. So nobody is going to miss the fact that you went to Barnard and Columbia. But you just want to think, again, we're thinking back to especially that first skim, what's most relevant, the fact that you went to Barnard and were, majored in a specific thing, or the work that you've been doing that correlates with what they're looking for. So it's a judgment call. All of these things are your choice ultimately, but that's the general rule of thumb. Similarly, on the second one here, most people tend to go organization and then title, but sometimes it is true that your title, especially in your more recent jobs, is more impressive, and you'll want to lead with that. You just have to once you make the choice for the first job, you have to follow it for all of them. And then the age comes up a lot. Advice varies. There are people who are absolute about this, like, don't say, hide your age, ageism is terrible, and, do that. But other people who will argue that we need to own our age, own our experience. So the second bullet, though, is important, which is when I first started doing this 10 or 11 years ago, it was still, when you took your dates off and when you shaved things off, it was actually looked upon with suspicion, and people would assume you were just trying to hide your age. It's become so common to do that, to leave the dates off of education and to shave off some of your earlier experiences or some combination of that it's not really, people don't blink an eye at it anymore. So it's actually okay to do that if you prefer to. So, but it can get tricky. Sometimes those are very early experiences were really good experiences. And there's other times where you're applying for something where your longevity in the career is going to be really valued. So definitely a case-by-case decision. We're almost there, and this annoying scrolling will stop. Great. The one page or two, I think I've mentioned this a couple times in passing here. Generally speaking, the only people who get really upset with more than one page are people who feel like if you've just graduated from college, you don't have enough experience to justify 2 pages. So that's why the general rule of thumb is, if you're a college student or just graduated, you should curate the application resume so that it's 1 page. But after that, if you have enough relevant, and key there being relevant information, to fill at least 2/3 of the second page, then it's fine. And again, remember, most people nowadays are scrolling through on their computer. They're not physically going through the resumes, although some people do still print them out. But so it's just less of an issue than it used to be. So again, it's more of a judgment call on your part of, as you're curating this, if you've got that relevant information and you need more space, go for it. If you don't, if you can streamline it to 1 page, that's great too. Yeah, and then including your actual snail mail address, as they say. A lot of people stopped doing that once this all went digital. And then just a note of address prejudice is that it could be anything from commuting to the fact that you're that you're out of town. There can be a bias against that. Hang on okay. And then the Word versus PDF can get a little tricky. When you upload to a system, there's different applicant tracking systems out there that companies use, and though in general they find it easier to Word documents. I'm so sorry. I need to go sign for something. I'll be right back. The perils from working from home. Great, thanks for your patience. Okay, and final thoughts. All right, I think I mentioned this earlier. This can all seem a little daunting, especially if some of the things I've introduced are different from the way you've been doing your resumes. So it's going to take a little work for those of you who are going to be shifting. Some of you may be doing most of this already, and it won't be such a big deal. But again, it's going to take a little work up front, but it should even out. And being able to customize and get your resumes out relatively quickly after you see a job should come easier. So just a couple things about what's coming up. As I said, you're welcome to attend all of the sessions in the series or drop in and out or listen to them later. And then I tried to put in a little more information about making an advising appointment. A few of you have already done so. I mean, I encourage you, if you want to look specifically about interview prep or cover letter, that if it's not time sensitive, that you wait until after the session to make the appointment, but you are welcome at any point. So you can make appointments online through Barnard Handshake. And the little bullet here might be confusing. Basically, Handshake, you either are going to create an employer account or a student account, and student covers both students and alumni. They just don't make that distinction. In the system, you're all considered students. So that's that. But then it makes it seem when you're creating the account or verifying your account that you have to have a uni or a .edu email, and that is not true for alumni. So specifically, you should look for the button underneath that says sign in with email, and then you should use a non-student email address. So certainly not your old Barnard or Columbia student address. And if you've been in a graduate program where the university used Handshake, don't use that same email. That just messes, Handshake is an underlying platform, and that sort of messes things up. So basically, choose an email address that is doesn't have an edu at the end, unless, of course, you happen to work in an educational institution and haven't used Handshake somewhere before. So I think that's all kind of confusing, which is why I put the Beyond Barnard at barnard.edu. So if you run into any trouble accessing Handshake or verifying your account, just email us and somebody will get in touch with you. Okay, and great. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to thank you all for participating, and I'm going to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to start with the Q&A section and just start going through, and then I'll circle back. I think some of you might have put questions in the chat area as well. So will you be able to give us access to the list of verbs? I couldn't copy the slide. Oh, I should have said that from the beginning. Yes, you will get a copy of the PowerPoint as well as a link to the recording following the event. Maybe, Lacey, if you could just let me know, I forget the timing on that, if you get the PowerPoint out right away. So yes, and then also, if you are able to access Handshake, there's a resources section, and there's a resume guide. There's some sample resumes. At the moment, the resumes definitely skew student and recent alum, so we're working on getting some more experienced or alumni examples in there as well. But check out the resources, and one of the resources in there is action verbs for resumes. So great. Is it unethical to change my name on a resume? I have an ethnic name, and I noticed a much lower response. This brings up a really good point. I just was watching, I think yesterday, I saw a clip from Trevor Noah talking about the studies about, where they submitted the exact same resume and changed the name to Black sounding, ethnic sounding, and that lower response rate. This is a very true thing that happens. And so it's an interesting question. Is that unethical? The tricky part is going to be later down the road when you get hired and your official name is different, but you definitely, you can definitely address that. I wouldn't necessarily bring up the fact that you were shifting it for bias or anti-bias purposes, but I think if you have a name, I mean, certainly there's people who use, their name changes for a variety of reasons, married, divorced, just a change of name. And so if you wanted to change a professional name that's different from what's on your birth certificate or on your official things, I think you can do that. You just have to be prepared to explain it down the road, either in the, usually it's going to be at the interview stage where you're filling out, official forms for HR, either during the interview process or when you've been hired. So you just need to choose. Yeah, just be prepared for that and be consistent. So I think choosing a different name for your professional documents can work. And happy to talk about the nuances of that individually with anybody. One versus 2-page resume. I think the key thing is, again, if you can comfortably fit your relevant information that you want to share onto one page, go for it. But if it does carry over to the second page, try and make it take up more than half or more, or about 2/3 of that, at least 2/3 of that second page. So it's funny, it's actually, it's a developmental thing, right? When you graduate from college and you start getting more experience, it's like your margins gradually get smaller and your font gets a little smaller. And then when you make the leap to 2 pages, now it's exactly the opposite. You now are going to maybe go up a font size and make your margins bigger again, so that you sort of cover more space. So I think the key thing, again, it's this curation idea. What do you want to include, and can you comfortably fit it in? And if you can't comfortably fit it into 1 page, it's fine. You can go to that second page. Okay. Oh, good question. Don't use generic categories like education. Yeah, I should have been clearer about that. That goes to what I was saying about the experience section. So instead of you definitely can use education, and in fact, you should use standard terms for that. What we don't want to be generic is experience or work experience or professional experience. We want you to customize that to coding experience. Analysis and strategy experience. We want you to characterize it in that way and not be generic there. Mixed feedback on, do I format my experiences in summary form or bullet points? Thank you. So I would say bullets are preferred, especially for that first read. It's just easier to read bullets, and it's easier for someone to skim. So I think the preference is for bullets. I would say that I've seen some interesting resumes where someone has done, it can be really helpful in the achievement idea, trying to focus on achievements. I've seen interesting examples where somebody will write a sentence or two right underneath the information about the company and title and dates, etc., that either describes the organization or describes their role in sort of a general way, and then uses the bullets to specifically hone in on specifics. So I think that hybrid model can be good, but I think that a resume that is sort of in paragraph or summary form, which is I think what you're talking about, it looks dense and it can be a little off-putting, again, especially during that skim part where somebody's looking quickly through. Most hiring managers are used to bullets. They're just faster and easier to read. I have a PhD. Should I put my education first? And what does that long educational path do to the question of ageism? I can't hide my decade of graduate school so easily. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I do think I would argue in the favor of owning that experience, even if it shows a truer reflection of you being older. It's impressive to have a PhD and to make it through that. So the question really is relevance. If what you are applying to is going to, if your PhD is relevant to it, and some of the specific work you did is relevant, then I would lead with that. If it's not relevant, or in some cases, it can actively work against you, especially if your degree is in something that's not obviously relevant to, then it can, think about the first thing they're going to see is that you are an expert in this very specific thing, potentially, that's not applicable to what you're applying to, and that can be sort of off-putting. So again, it's that sometimes you're going to lead with it, I think, and sometimes you might not, depending on where you're applying and what kind of role it is. So you're never leaving it off completely, but where you put it. Again, you're always thinking about when that person is skimming, what's the first thing they see? And what we want the first thing for them to see is the thing that's most relevant about you and most aligns with what they're looking for. Is it true that when a resume reflects an AOL.com email address that is not even read? It's possibly true for some people. I mean, it's very superficial. And so you would hope that people don't do that, but there is a bias against AOL.com. Even Yahoo, I think, has gotten a little bit dated. Definitely, I don't know if the story is relevant anymore, but I spent some time when I wasn't working and was home full time, and spent a little bit of time in PTA world. And I think there was more the timing than the fact that it was PTA world, but a lot of people had those joint email accounts. It was both their and their husbands. So that's another thing that pops up that, again, just kind of speaks to not super tech savvy, not as up to date. So I would say, I don't know if people reject it out of hand, but I think it's a good practice to create a new, generally Gmail, but it doesn't have to be Gmail, but to create a new, more up-to-date email address that you can, I call it my personal professional, right? So like I've kept my old Yahoo, which is what I used to sign up for, all of the bonus points and everything. And then I have my work email, which you all have seen. And then the in-between is a boring, Christine Shin at Gmail. So I vote for that middle option. Are Google Doc resumes acceptable? Interesting. If you are, I'm trying to think. I would say if you are asked to submit a resume attached to an email, I would not do it as a Google Doc. I would save the Google Doc as a Word or PDF. But if they ask for that, or if it seems, or if you're uploading it, yeah, I could see that's a good question. You've thrown me a little. I haven't really thought about that. So I'll definitely circle back and let you know if I'm wrong about that, and try and incorporate it next week. But I think under certain circumstances it could be acceptable, but I think it's still pretty standard to attach it as a sort of separate thing. But yeah, let me circle back on that. I think it could be used in some circumstances. Recently got my master's degree. I'm wondering if you would still suggest placing the education section toward the end of the resume. I think if you, recent grads, so that includes both if you've recently graduated from Barnard, or if you've recently graduated from a graduate school program, and particularly if it's either directly relevant to what you're applying to, or explains what you've been doing for the last couple of years if you went full time, or if there's any part of that skill set that you learned while you're doing. So yeah, I think generally if you've recently completed, it's fine to lead with it. So, can you sign up with more than one university handshake with the same email? No. And sometimes even doing it with different emails is problematic. So this has popped up a couple of times, and I always have to turn it over to the people on our staff who know handshake in and out. So I would, I would definitely use a different email. And if you still run into trouble, let me know, and I'll turn it over to our team to help straighten it out, because it can cause weird problems. It's one of the little weird annoyances of handshake. Although I have to say, it's been a couple years since that came up, so maybe they fixed that. So I would say use a different email and then circle back to me if you have haven't run into any problems. I've also wondered, is there a benefit to include location if I've moved from Yeah, definitely. So that's great. If you've just moved and you're looking for a job in the new place, then, and especially because your experience is going to be in the old place. So yeah, definitely putting that front and center that you are, you're in the new city now and definitely located. So that's good. What resume advice for transitioning from a 20-year State Department career to private sector? Framing, skills-based, how to translate experience. Do you have a list of resume consultants you recommend? Yeah, so anytime you make a transition, and that's a big one, potentially, there's two main strategies. One is going to be that focus on transferable skills. So it's moving away from some of the specific job speak that could be specific to what you've been doing, right? So State Department is fairly specific, and it's taking a step back and looking more broadly. So instead of talking in your bullets about using specific language, that's kind of, especially jargon or acronyms or things that are very specific to that sector. It's how can I rephrase this sort of for the lay person, or how can I rephrase this, a sort of broader context, so if you were managing operations, how can you talk about managing operations, in a broader way. And I think the framing, especially if you do that skills section at the top, it's pulling out those specific skills. If you worked with databases, if you worked with, internal communications, what are those specific things you did within your job, but that you are looking to do in the new place, the new field, and focusing in on those so that it frames that, like, yes, you've been someplace for 20 years doing a fairly specific thing, but you're going to pick up those skills and apply them to this new field. I don't have a list of resume consultants off the top of my head, but I can do a little digging. We'd sometimes get asked for private career coaches and advisors, and so I'll reach out to that network and see if they have specific consultants. So, and that's a great word of mouth thing to ask people about. Worried that one of my references as an AOL address, is that an issue? Nah, that's they're not going to hold that against you. That's fine. I would like to leave out dates on jobs for age reasons. Do I indicate the length of time? And yeah, no, unfortunately, you cannot leave out dates on jobs. You can leave off the dates of graduation, and you can leave out jobs entirely, but you can't take the dates away from the jobs. That would be, not only is it a red flag because you're not following the norms of how resumes work, but they would definitely, it would be like that step over to she's trying to hide her age. So it kind of defeats the purpose anyway. So, but yeah, I can definitely talk to you one-on-one about, are there particular jobs you could either leave out, or in doing the two sections of experience, the sort of relevant section and the less relevant, that can sometimes work to your advantage to, sort of highlight, it can hide, it can more subtly take attention away from how long you've been doing a particular thing or something like that. If we've learned new skills while being laid off during quarantine, where do you recommend highlighting those skills on the resume? Oh, that's a great question. You've got a couple options. You could put it under education if you want, especially if you've been taking, courses or certification, or even, just sort of webinars and stuff from a particular institution. But I would probably instead highlight the skills, and that might be a good, that could be a good reason to use a skills summary or a profile up at the top. And you could hide, especially if the new skills you've been acquiring are relevant to what you want to apply to. Sometimes people will do a double list up at the top, like 2 lists of bullets. And sometimes the rule of thumb is to do sort of new or relevant, or sort of what we call hard skills on the left, and then some of your softer skills on the right. And again, just that person who's skimming will sort of, their eye will go to the left first, and they can see, oh, she learned how to code, or she learned how to write grants. So that's cool. Good. Somebody asked this in the chat already. I'm boosting. How do you list contract short-term roles that lasted for several months but less than a year? Also, how do you recommend separating these freelance projects, contract work, from your more long-term roles on your resume? Good question. I think generally what you want to do, I think the key thing is, I don't think you have to have a separate section. And I don't think you necessarily need to separate them out. I think what the worry is when you list a contract position is it's going to look super short. And so I think the key thing is to just indicate that it was contract. So what you can do is, following your title, you could put contract in parentheses, or in your first or last bullet, you can say, contract project, and that's generally understood to mean you are hired to do a specific thing for a specific amount of time. And then the other thing sometimes people do with freelancing or contract or project-based roles is they put them under a heading. That can get a little tricky, so it's easier to work with you one-on-one on this, but where they would put, you could, for instance, put freelance editor as your job entry, and then bullet some of the specific projects you worked on or specific clients, or something like that. Definitely take a look, actually, if you want sort of more immediate results than meeting with me one-on-one or somebody else on my team, take a look at Ask a Manager under the resume section, or there's also a section where you can type in a more specific topic, because I know this question has come up and she's given different ways to sort of handle that. So so I would send you there, and then I'm happy to also talk with you one-on-one about, when it's often easier to answer these questions if I can sort of see how you got it at the moment and then suggest changes. What if more than one company listed on your resume is out of business, no longer exists? How does that come across? I don't think that's a huge deal. I mean, that happens. And so, and that also comes up with like if a name has changed or something like that. So I don't think you have to worry about it too much on your resume. If you are using a reference from there and you're submitting a reference, you might want to make a note of that, X, so-and-so, manager at X company, company has since closed or company has since changed its name. But I think that, it just sort of depends on your track. I mean, if somebody, for instance, had worked over the last 10 or 20 years for tech startups, there's going to be, it's sort of a given that a lot of those might have gone out of business, and that doesn't discount the experience you had there or the work you did there. So, so I don't think it's a huge thing, I guess, unless you've only worked for now obsolete companies. but yeah, I think one or two or even more, it's not a huge deal. Poppy, I'll circle back to the chat and see if, oh, there we go. Maybe yours is coming up. If I left my page up a year ago, could I put relevant volunteer experience under the experience in resume in LinkedIn rather than in the volunteer section? Yeah, definitely on the resume. You don't have to have a volunteer section or characterize anything as volunteer on your resume if you don't want to. You can. That's the beauty of saying communications experience, as your broad category, and then anything you've done in a volunteer, project-based or full-time, position can be grouped under there in reverse chronological order. So that can be really helpful. And then on LinkedIn, same thing. You can, I think that their main section is called experience. And so if you want a volunteer experience to be featured there, there's no requirement that something be paid or unpaid. I'd say on LinkedIn, people use the volunteer section for things that are, less relevant to what they're looking for and just sort of a rounding out who you are and what's important to you. If you send in an application and someone in the company is a second connection on LinkedIn, but you don't even know how you're connected to the person who connects you, is it worth to request connection with a note that says, I just applied, I'm great, check me out? That's a good question. I would say, you don't even know how you could, yeah, that happens from time to time. LinkedIn actually used to have a thing that showed you when and how you connected to the person, but they've taken that away. So I would say, yeah, I think you just have to be upfront with that. And so, so one thing you could do is reach out to the second connection and say, hey, it looks like we both know person X, or your name came up. Your name came up because I'm applying to a position at this organization. It seems like we both know person X, and then just go straight to the, straight to the ask, which is, if you're on LinkedIn, you could just ask to connect to them directly, and then once they connect you or message you back, you can then suggest a conversation, or you can go straight to, if you, I know we don't know each other, but I'd love to chat with you about your experience working there. So, and by sort of taking the heat off of, you're not asking them directly to put in a good word for you, you're asking them to chat with you about their experience working there. And then if you have an intelligent conversation, then either they might offer, or you could then ask for the actual referral. So. What about headhunters? Do you recommend those? Yeah, so headhunters, it sort of depends on the field. And then it's just a buyer beware type of thing. There are some excellent headhunters out there, and there are some really bad recruiters / headhunters out there. And so trust your gut. And if you're getting, negative vibes from somebody, move along. Also, word of mouth is really good for this. Like who, are there recruiters, are there headhunting agencies people have worked with, colleagues, former colleagues, that you can recommend. I think the key thing to remember with all headhunters and recruiters is that, generally speaking, they are working for the company, for their client, which is, let me put that more directly. Their client is the company, not you. And so they definitely want to work with you and present you, if possible, as a good candidate, but their primary concern is picking good candidates that they think will be, successful. And so it can be challenging working with a headhunter or a recruiter for that reason, but you just kind of have to keep reminding yourself that that's what they're after. And so they may not be all warm and fuzzy and coachy with you. They can be relatively dismissive, some of them, but press on. Yeah, we're actually trying to put together something. It's probably not going to be till the fall, but we do have a number of alumni working in the recruiting, headhunting space, and those are always some of our most popular. Anytime you get a chance to listen to somebody who works in HR or recruiting or headhunting, it's just always so great to get their insights. So keep an eye on the offerings. That's something that we like to do from time to time. When submitting our resume, how should the document be labeled? Last name, first name, resume, first name, last name, resume. I would go last name, first name, and then resume. And then actually, when I talked about a simple filing system, one of the things you can do is often if you put your last name, first name, and then the company name, first of all, that lets them know that you actually meant to send it to them. And then it's good for you when you're like hunting for that version of the resume. It can be handy to find that. I'm going to just do, we've run over time. And so let me wrap up quickly, answer 2 last questions, and then we'll look through for any others. I was told I could leave off dates for earlier job experience at the same company more than 20 years ago. Yeah, I mean, you can leave off, told I could leave off dates for earlier. That's an interesting question. You could, if all you're doing is listing the company, like some people will, instead, they won't bullet it out, they'll just have a section for prior experience and then just list company and title and location. Maybe you could get away with leaving off the date. I'd have to see it before I give you a definitive answer on that. It makes me nervous to leave off the dates entirely, but again, different people give different advice, and it's ultimately your call. Do I have examples of the optional section that focuses on what you bring to the job? Yes, but not directly at hand. So let me put those together and share them next week or in the follow-up email. And will this webinar be sent out to re-listen to? Yes, absolutely. I'm not quite sure of the timing, but you should be getting, and I think actually today when the Zoom link was sent, there was also a link to where it was posted. So yeah, you'll definitely be able to access it. So I'm going to end things here. Thank you all so much for being so engaged, and I'll see you again next week. I didn't get a chance to watch the chat as I went along, so I think we can capture that, and I'll take a look afterwards. So, but feel free to email me directly or at Beyond Barnard if you've got feedback or questions that we didn't get to. Thanks so much, everybody, and take good care.